Good afternoon. Welcome back to this workshop organized by the Collective for Political Determinants of Health. If there are new people joining us online, I want to introduce myself. I'm Katarina Storing from the University of Oslo and co-director of the Collective. We're now going to move on to a session that is focusing on post-pandemic political economy. Before I hand over to our chair, I just want to remind you that this is a hybrid workshop. And those of you who are online, you are very welcome and encouraged to participate in the discussions. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, in which case we may call on you to ask your question using both video and audio. Or if you prefer, you may ask your question or comment and written in the Q&A function. So this session is going to be chaired by Sakiko Fukuda-Parr. I introduced her earlier, but I'll do so again for those of you who weren't there. Sakiko Fukuda-Parr is a professor of international affairs at the New School in New York City. And she is my co-director in the Collective for Political Determinants of Health. Her teaching and research has focused on human rights and development, global health, and global goal setting and governance by indicators, amongst other things. And she contributes actively to international policy and research processes on many levels, including as chair of the UN Committee on Development Policy, chairs of the boards of Knowledge Ecology International, and of course, as part of the various commissions that we've heard about today. And she's also a distinguished fellow at the JICA Research Institute in Tokyo. So with that, I will hand over to you, Sakiko, to take us through the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. So this session is on political economy post-COVID, and we have 3 papers and 4 speakers. I'm going to very briefly introduce all the speakers, and I'll start with James Pfeiffer because he is online, but I don't see him on screen. Is he on screen? Oh, he's not there yet?
No,
He is there. We just can't see him. Okay. So, so James is professor of Department of Global Health in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington, Seattle, with a joint appointment in the Department of Anthropology. He's also executive director of Health Alliance International, HIAI, and oversees health system strengthening projects in Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, and Timor-Leste. He's done a lot of work in medical anthropology and public health in Africa, particularly. We have Ted Schrecker. Is he also online? Okay. Oh, yes, there they are.
Sakiko is here.
Yeah. Okay. But you see, I'm too short to see the screen. So another disadvantage of not being tall. So Ted is a political scientist who moved from Canada in 2013 to take up a post as professor of global health policy at Durham. Then at Newcastle. Then he retired. So he has done enormous amount of research on the effects of globalization on health and coordinated the knowledge network of globalization that supported the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. His current work emphasizes the political economy of health. And then we have 2 colleagues who are here in the room. Ron Labonté, who really needs no introduction, so I'll cut his introduction really short to save time. Yeah, he's a professor emeritus in the School of Public Health, University of Ottawa. He has 45-year career in public health, spanning government position, international consultancies, and universities. I think we all know him well as a chair, as the editor of Globalization and Health, and he's also very active in the People's Health movement. And finally, we have Remco, who was already introduced, but in case there are new people joining who did not hear the introduction in the last session. I have to find his...
The V, maybe.
Yes, V, all the way to V.
Yeah, it's up there.
No, but he's not in V.
Yeah. There, yes.
Okay, but it's not in order. He's somewhere between Schrecker and Cell, which is very strange. Anyway, he is a public health doctor and global health researcher. He has a position as a senior research fellow, global health policy at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, and is also lecturer in global health at Maastricht. But I thought you were in Berlin now.
Yeah, it should be updated. Indeed.
Yes, and so would you like to say where you are in Berlin?
I'm working as a senior researcher at the Center for Planetary Health Policy. This is a think tank affiliated with the German Alliance on Climate and Health.
Very good. He is also involved with various other institutions like the Medicus Mundi International, Network Health for All, and I won't lead, and WIMOS, and Médecins du Monde, and others. I think we can start with the paper by Ron and Remco, and you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. We're going to be doing a bit of a dog and pony show, so I'm going to give some initial comments and then pass it over to Remco to do all the mop-up and say the really important stuff. I should also just add, because so many people around the collective have been involved in some way or another, is that with Katerini being another co-editor-in-chief, is that Remco's on the editorial board of the same journal. So not that I'm making a plug for the journal, but I'm making a plug for the journal. So I'll probably repeat a little bit of what I said earlier this morning in the comments, but I hope I'll put a bit of a different spin on it. So, I mean, we've been discussing kind of so far the evidence of the past 10 years' failure to deal effectively with the existential polycrises that we're now facing. And the most urgent one, I think we all recognize, is the era of climate crisis and sixth grade extinction. And that this era is intimately linked to global inequalities and rising geopolitical conflicts suggests in some ways that we're probably facing an imminent future of some kind of collapse of one form or another, from which our current political economy is completely ill-prepared, if not also part of the problem. Now, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, as many of us are aware, and then with the failure of any substantial reform after the 2008 financial crisis, attention was again given to the systemic failures of our economic system to sustain human environmental health for all. Now, elsewhere, I've commented on the Build Back Better policies of the USA and other high-income countries, the European Union Green Deal and Next Generation EU. And in some of those comments, I noted that there were some important reforms in those initiatives that should be embraced, but also systemic limitations. And those limitations were due largely to the power of corporate lobbies, polarized politics, and increasingly autocratic regimes on both sides of the Atlantic. 3 recent initiatives adopted a slightly different approach, and they were arguing the need to shift our current political economy away from traditional measures of GDP growth, not exactly a new argument, and towards well-being economies that are premised on, and I'm quoting here, equitable distribution of wealth, health, and well-being while protecting the planet's resources for future generations of all species. So kind of something that's very easy to say and admittedly extremely difficult to implement, and certainly under the production and consumption drivers of capitalism's accumulative logic. Now, the first initiative I want to speak to briefly is the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, and that largely argued for governments to play a much more activist role in shaping markets to deliver on democratically chosen health, social, and environmental goals. And it was really drawing on a lot of the arguments of the Council Chair, Mariana Mazzucato, who talked about the need to create market shaping for public good outcomes rather than governments simply bailing out market failures. Now, this in turn would require increased progressive taxation and novel fiscal policies, steadfast opposition to austerity, and also conditionalities that governments would place on funding or even policies that would directly or indirectly benefit private actors. Now, the second initiative, it had some passing reference to the WHO Council, is a recent WHO internal report that was promoting the idea of well-being societies as a kind of a, quote, new social contract that balances social, economic, environmental considerations as the center of political and societal decision-making. So we're getting a certain theme here in terms of what we think we ought to be really important in terms of a new political economy. Now, it was refreshingly critical of economic models based on, and I'm quoting, massive and intensive production and consumption of goods, and that's a point that will be returned to with Remco, while explicitly acknowledging, and again I'm quoting, inequitable distribution of resources reflect political legacies and colonialism. So it had a bit of a tough analytical language in some of this report. But it's also kind of pretty silent on whether capitalism as an economic system or a political economy could be reformed to accomplish what, in many respects, were blue sky economic ideals. Now, the third initiative, and I think it had the most specific set of policy directions, is the collaborative Earth for All report. And that was a 50-year return to the Club of Rome roots in its 1972 Limits to Growth modeling study. So Earth for All, it identified 5 great turnarounds that were urgently needed, basically to ensure we had a livable planet. So we needed to end poverty, address inequality, accelerate gender inequity, transform food systems, and transition to green energy. Again, pretty hard to argue with those as kind of a high-level turnaround ideals or goals. It also kind of modeled 17 policy goals or policy measures that, if rapidly implemented, so it used the kind of a similar kind of modeling that it did back in 1972, it would ensure a livable future in the year 2100, and that was through a creation of what they called the well-being economy based on the commons, in which resources were managed collectively and democratically. Social processes would foster cooperative relationships, and new logics of production would be created. Now, all 3 initiatives, and they all kind of band together under this new moniker, well, old moniker, but at least under this notion of well-being economy, they actually constitute very powerful reform statements, especially in efforts to try to transform capitalism into something that was more humane, equitable, and environmentally sustainable. But none of them explicitly question whether capitalist economies are capable of institutionalizing such reforms. Although the Earth for All report is more explicitly critical of capitalism than the other 2, and particularly the rentier form that I mentioned earlier this morning, or what Yanis Varoufakis calls the techno-feudalism. What remains unstated in all these reports is how to overcome the opposition of powerful economic actors and elites whose self-interests might allow, as they have in the past, the kind of small mitigating public measures, the ones that we referred to earlier as the low-hanging fruit of these kind of different reform options, but who would challenge anything that threatened to reduce substantially their own wealth and privileges. And this concern reflects the long-held Marxist critique of the role of the state as primarily being the protection of capitalism and capital accumulation. So it challenges somewhat the notion that a strong, reinvigorated state, unless we actually interrogate what its relationship is to the capitalist mode of production, we will simply get mitigating changes that will allow the system to continue. So in light of historical evidence that until quite recently extreme poverty worsened with capitalism and only lessened during periods of organized resistance or near economic collapse, and that the 30 post-war golden years of Keynesian economics and the New Deal, that they were an anomaly unlikely to be repeated. So in light of that kind of historical work that's been done, the Marxist critique of the role of the state relative to the capitalist economy is not one that's easy to dismiss.
Breaking together and the need to transform to a post-growth economic scenario. It is in this context that a growing group of academics, practitioners and activists have advanced the position that we have already overshot the limits of our Earth system capacity and that a certain form of societal, economic, ecological collapse is inevitable. We will hence be transformed, whether we like it or not. And so the question is how to organize socio-economic transformation in a fair and ecological sustainable manner. Their argument for an economy of sufficiency rather than growth per se suggests the need for a more profound paradigm change, often referred to as degrowth or post-growth economics. With its origins in political ecology, such an economic sees the economy as a subsystem of society, which is a subsystem of the biosphere, and argues that many environmental problems are caused by the scale of economic activity exceeding environmental limits. Political ecology also emphasizes the role of power asymmetries and unequal distribution of resources among economic actors for shaping the structure of the economy and for driving economic growth and exploitation. It shares its core aim to improve human well-being and social equity with the well-being economy initiatives described above, but it is more explicit on the need to rapidly reduce resource use. Economic growth in GDP terms is already steadily declining in the global north, despite societal consumption and production of material and service goods continuing to rise. We hence prefer to use the term post-growth rather than the contested degrowth frame. The imperiling overshoot of the planetary boundaries is often referred to as the Anthropocene, a new geological order, but the term anthro is misleading since this overshoot is being driven less by individual humans than by a global economic system built and dependent upon continued economic growth that is of primary benefit to those in the global north. This is a phenomenon described as the imperial mode of living. It's an unjust system relying upon a neo-colonialist, historic and contemporary exploitation of wage labor and resource extractions from countries in the global south. The scale of this outwards and upwards flow of wealth and the power it brings is stunning, with studies suggesting that net appropriation from the south to the north over the period of 90 to 2015 represents a value of about 242 trillion US dollars. These captured resources could otherwise have been mobilized to meet domestic needs in southern countries, but instead have been appropriated to service production and consumption in the global north through unequal trade relations, exploitative business practices by transnational corporations, and technological dependencies unfairly protected via international intellectual property regimes. So the production and consumption patterns in the global north are responsible for the vast share of excess energy and resource use that is causing global ecological breakdown, while it's populations of the global south that are bearing most of the immediate health and social costs of this breakdown. So by focusing on scaling down northern material and energy use while redistributing wealth and income more fairly, post-growth principles and policies acknowledge the reality of differentiated and historical responsibilities for the overshoot of those boundaries. Post-growth economics is then not only in line with the planetary health agenda, it's also deeply rooted into a continuation of decolonial thought and activism that goes back to thinkers like Allende, Fanon and Thomas Sankara. How to move forward with all of this? There are major questions on how to move forward with such a post-capitalist, post-growth economic agenda that is relevant for both global and planetary health aims. It's similar to the well-being economy initiatives. Post-growth economics at its core abandons GDP growth as an objective and instead reorganizes production around societal and planetary well-being rather than on consumption and accumulation. Through analysis from the ecological and feminist economics, post-growth policies focus on equitable meeting human needs within those boundaries and acknowledging the role of the informal economy in doing so, partly by measuring and rewarding its contributions. Post-growth policies aim to reduce an imbalanced gender distribution of unpaid care work and harness the potential for care work to be turned into decent employment for all. Central to this post-growth care economy is protecting the rights, wage and living conditions of all care workers, as Tim Jackson always has been arguing for. So researchers, institutions, politicians have considered a broad and inclusive post-growth strategy that can be beneficial for health at large if governments consider 4 policy pathways as a package in moving this forward. And I think we have to consider this also in relation to the global governance of health. First, the whole biocapacity part. Policies that could include phasing out fossil fuels, limits to extraction of raw materials, and measures for nature protection, and the restoration to ensure healthy and resilient soils, forests, and marine and other ecosystems. Fairness. Fiscal instruments that could be used for a more equal society by eradicating income and wealth extremes as well as super profits. These might include a carbon or wealth tax and the setting of minimum and maximum income caps. Well-being for all. This is about an ecological sensitive welfare state where people have access to essential infrastructure. It might be through a universal basic service job guarantee and price control for essential goods and services. Lastly, but very important, active democracy. Citizen assemblies could be set up with mandates to formulate social acceptable sufficiency strategy and strengthen policies. It's based on ecological limits, fairness and well-being for all, but should be done together with trade unions and civil society. And yes, there's an important place for some green growth initiatives within a post-growth strategy, but it might face opposition from vested interests in maintaining the current system. The opposition will need to be met by collective actions through what some call a movement of movements, such as the global tapestry of alternatives, modernist eco-socialism, and they must need to find common ground with post-growth kind of trajectories. It's building alliances across these different initiatives. So what would it mean for a research agenda? And then I will end after there. Four things. Identify changing social attitudes and practices using polls and focus groups. 2, study transition towns and cooperatives and health and care projects that prioritize these post-growth modes of living. It's the case study approach. Action research with actual political, emancipatory and health movements that are aligned with these values. And lastly, investigate the political and economic interests and actors that might oppose or support these post-growth policies. So, in the end, we need to connect with progressive actors in the periphery. It's important that we do not only look upward, but that we connect with those in the periphery, the capitalist periphery, because they know what still needs to grow and what not. And so we should not rely also on the more techno-positive or even eco-authoritarian policy solutions that are so often promoted here in the global north, where governments will not automatically degrow or post-grow their economies. So, and this is the last quote from Jason Hickel, a post-growth researcher, none of this will happen on its own. It will require a major political struggle against those who so benefit so prodigiously from the status quo. It's not a time for mild reformism, tweaking around to the edges of a failing system. This is a time for revolutionary, paradigmatic change.
Thank you. Okay, so next we move on to Ted. Hello, Ted. Very nice to see you on screen.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, we can. Hi, Ted.
Great.
It's probably colder in Oslo than it is where you are in the frozen Canada, Canadian North.
Now, the moment of truth. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Well, in the first paper I wrote about the post-pandemic world, I started with the opening sentences of J.G. Ballard's magnificent dystopian novel, High Rise, which read like this. Right. And the giveaway here is that phrase, now that everything has returned to normal, because the normal to which things had returned was the aftermath of an outbreak of class conflict among the affluent residents of a 40-story tower block that saw many of them killed, the building's infrastructure destroyed, and the surviving residents, and many of them hadn't survived, reduced to strategies like killing and eating the pets of their less fortunate former neighbors. Now, the point is that very extraordinary circumstances quickly become normalized. And my argument is that's what's going to happen as we move forward, we hope, from the worst of the pandemic. By way of background, in the words of the indispensable 2022 World Inequality Report, the world today is and has long been like a giant South Africa, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And just a couple of images to show you what this looks like. This is a version of the famous elephant curve that Branko Milanovic developed, looking at how the economic growth over 40 years, 1980 to 2020, was distributed worldwide. And you can see that the bottom 50% captured just 9% of the total growth. This is the bottom 50% by income of all the people in the world. And the top 1%, with a high average pre-tax income per adult, captured almost a quarter of global growth. Wealth is almost always distributed more unequally than income, and between 1995, so well into the era of globalization, and the first years of the pandemic, we see an even more unequal distribution, with the bottom 50% of the world's population having captured just 2% of global wealth growth, and the top 1% having captured almost 2/5. Now, within country inequality grew in much of the world as well pre-pandemic, and that's the kind of inequality that tends to be more relevant to public policy on social determinants of health. You can see this happened in a number of countries, but not in all. Brazil, for example, didn't see much growth in inequality, but it was already one of the most unequal countries in the world, along with South Africa. Now, on to the tipping point concept, which is key to my argument. It's most familiar from discussions of global environmental change, from examples like the hypothesized transition of the Amazon rainforest from rainforest to savanna or steppe, at the point where deforestation means it can no longer supply a substantial proportion of its own moisture, which is what large rainforests do. But the concept is not limited to global environmental change. And in fact, there's an extensive literature on its use in other contexts, including the social sciences. This particular synthetic definition involves 4 elements: small quantitative changes in the system, a nonlinear change process driven by system internal feedback mechanisms, and at the end, a qualitatively different state of the system. And although I haven't done it yet, I'm working on a matrix in which I look at contemporary inequality and slot it into the matrix. Now, tipping points are not necessarily negative. So in the context of the pandemic, social protection programs that reduce deprivation could have been implemented widely and incorporated into the social protection fabric. But as this headline from a story last year in the New York Times points out that's not what happened. And that's a story that occurred in many, many places, not just the US. So the new normal is likely to involve deepening inequality, more dollar millionaires worldwide, an increase in global billionaire wealth. And as the Oxfam report David McCoy cited in his wonderful talk this morning points out, this kind of pattern is continuing, partly at least because wealthy households invest more of their assets in financial assets, and those have gained in price most strongly. This pattern, again, according to the Oxfam analysis, is continuing. So the key message here, I think, is this. There is a tipping point beyond which inequality cannot be reduced effectively by way of economic and social policy. And in many jurisdictions, that tipping point has already been reached for at least 3 reasons. The first of these is the ungovernability of ultra wealth. Brooke Harrington, a sociologist who trained as a wealth manager for the 1%, drew this analogy, again, pre-pandemic, with e-commerce. And as an illustration, this is the website of a firm that advertises itself as the global leader in residence and citizenship by investment, and provides a helpful link to a list of countries that offer tax favorable resident status. And you can go to the website and read the list of the countries. It's not an issue just of ultra wealthy individuals and households, but also transnational corporations, as you can see from this Financial Times graph of the declining corporate tax rate. That number on the right, I've seen a more recent figure that suggests the annual shift of profits to tax havens is now on the order of $1 trillion US. But the politics go much deeper than the 1%ers and the TNCs. This is what a group of Australian researchers had to say about the consequences of this trend. A gap, the defining gap in terms of class structure being one not between the owners of the means of production and the workers, but between the asset rich and the asset poor. And we can see how this unfolded in the United States with the financialization of housing after the financial crisis, which was a trend that accelerated during the pandemic. This is the start of the pandemic. And on the other side, you have record levels of homelessness, and 1 in 4 of the tenant households paying over half their monthly income toward rent. So you have the gap between the asset rich and the asset poor, and the onset of a double precarity of housing and employment. This is now recognized even by the World Economic Forum, which we heard a bit about this morning. There will be a massive intergenerational transfer of that housing wealth that will further magnify inequality. Just another example, here's a Canadian graph showing the diffusion of stratospheric inner city housing values to the suburbs as much as 80 kilometers away from the downtown. And although this is a Canadian graph, I've used North American examples. The problem is worldwide, as sources like Bloomberg News have been reporting for at least a few years. Right. We combine these two dynamics, and we can explain the fate of proposals to tax wealth. In the early days of the pandemic, this was being viewed as inevitable, not only by UN agencies, but by the Financial Times editorial board. Well, here's what's happened more recently. Precipitous retreat from the idea on the part of parties of the center left. among the probable early casualties will be beverage-style universal health coverage because it has a substantial redistributive element. And as inequality continues to grow, Mr. and Mrs. Range Rover are not going to want to pay the taxes necessary to sustain the system, and it will collapse. This is already underway. The third point, there could be a separate presentation just on this one, the ideational dimension, the persistence and resilience of zombie neoliberalism. Mariana Mazzucato, whom Ron quoted earlier, has described this dominant economic paradigm that governments should intervene only to correct market failures as defined narrowly in microeconomic terms. To have any chance of success in implementing a Green New Deal, she argued, we need to radically reform and rearm the state. And Remco suggested a few ways in which that might need to happen, yet this approach is increasingly unthinkable. So on to the longue durée referred to in my title. This is, of course, Fernand Braudel's concept of long arcs of history as an antidote to what he and Emanuel Wallerstein have called a purely episodic historiography. In terms of inequality, the exemplary work here is Walter Scheidel's The Great Leveler, in which he argues that major reductions in inequality have occurred over the longue durée only under four conditions: wars, revolutions, plagues, and state failures. He, like many other people, including Ron, viewed the 30 golden years, or the great compression of inequality after the Second World War, as an anomaly, which I think is right, and leads to my conclusion. I love this quotation. After all, nobody...
Ted, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I need about 30 seconds. After all, nobody got up one balmy afternoon on the Capitoline Hill sometime in the 5th century and said that the Roman Empire was over and the Dark Ages had begun. Well, the point here is that specific chronological location of tipping points can only be identified, often can only be identified in retrospect. But future historians are likely to regard the pandemic as the tipping point beyond which the peaceful reversal of the long trend to increased inequality once again became impossible. Thank you.
It's very hard to clap on that note. So we now move on to James Pfeiffer. And by the way, I should have said this earlier in the proceedings. Those of you online particularly who have questions, I think you might put them online as we proceed, because we are, we will be collecting them. And those of you who in the room, I think you can obviously jot them down in your, so as not to forget them. We will have a good amount of discussion afterwards. So James, very nice to see you, and please go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Okay.
I'm hearing him.
Yeah, I can't unmute.
It's okay. You're good. You're
Can you
good.
hear
We
me
can now
now?
hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Great. So greetings from Seattle, Washington. And it's wonderful to see you. And I just want to quickly thank Sakiko Katerini Emma, the collective organizing this wonderful event. And it is just such an honor to be on the same panel as Ron, Remco, and Ted. Great talks. I'll jump in here. What I'm focusing on in this talk is the looming debt crisis and health equity, but I'm going to talk a bit about some New York State legislation that's underway, a political struggle going on here in the United States on looking at how to rein in private debt internationally. But I'm going to give just a little background here. So I want to start with a voice who has been referenced earlier from the Global South, Thomas Sankara. Many of you may have seen this quote from a speech on foreign debt way back in 1987 when the international debt crisis was growing. Debt's origins come from colonialism's origins. Those who lend us money are those who colonized us before. They are those who used to manage our states and economies. Debt is neo-colonialism in which colonizers transform themselves into technical assistants. We should better say technical assassins. Under its current form, that is imperialism-controlled debt, is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa. Just thought such a powerful statement and captures where we are now in our calls for decolonization of global health. We certainly have to be focusing on debt and what causes it. Another quote from the Global South, Dr. Paulo Ivo Garrido, who was the Minister of Health in Mozambique 2005-2010, with whom my organization worked extensively on the HIV scale-up of antiretroviral therapy in Mozambique. And he came and gave a talk at the University of Washington on the 40th anniversary of the Alma-Ata Primary Healthcare Conference. And he was asked, how does the Minister of Health handle getting greater budgets for his health system? And how does he work with his Ministry of Finance? And his response was, there are no ministries of finance in Africa. There is just the IMF. So I just wanted to start with that. As I think probably all of you know, there is an enormous debt crisis across the world. You can see this map. This is from Debt Justice UK, one of the debt justice advocacy groups, important ones in the world. 2022. I won't torture you with all the statistics, but somewhere between 54 and 60 countries are in deep debt distress across the world, middle income and low income countries. And it has just gotten worse and worse post-pandemic. So in 2022, this is from a World Bank press release back in December of a month ago. 2022, developing countries spent a record of $443 billion to service external public and public guaranteed debt in 2022. The increase in costs shifted scarce resources away from critical needs such as health, education, and the environment. So there's just a very direct relationship. The more indebted a country is, the more it's spending money on debt services, the less it's spending on health, education, all the things that we care about, and especially climate change, which has become a focus of debt justice work recently. So defaults are now becoming very common. Zambia and Ghana most recently are in default. Sri Lanka is in a real struggle right now. So it is a true global crisis that is intensified, is looking a lot more like the 1980s. So there was some debt relief during the pandemic. You may have heard about the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, in which the IMF and the World Bank and the G20 suspended debt payments for about a year from the Global South in recognition that while having to pay enormous amounts of debt service, countries would not be able to, struggle against the pandemic in their own countries. There was also something called the Common Framework, which was set up and is continuing to this day. The Common Framework was an IMF G20 approach, or still is an approach to helping Global South countries restructure their debt. It is basically a failure. Only 4 countries have managed to get through the onerous process, but that is an ongoing structure to try to deal with the intensifying crisis. Larry Summers, I'm not a fan of this guy, former Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, President of Harvard, basically a neoliberal economist, but he described the debt suspension initiative as a squirt gun meeting a massive conflagration, right? That it's nowhere near what was needed given the depth of the crisis. And then Jaime Atienza from Oxfam said the failure to cancel debt payments will only delay the tsunami of debt that will engulf many of the poorest countries, leaving them unable to afford investment, healthcare, social safety nets, etc. So this notion of a tsunami of debt was put out there, and that is exactly what's happening in the world now. It was already growing before the pandemic, and the pandemic intensified it. So just a quote about how do things look going forward. And this is just quoting a paper by Alex Kentikalenis and Thomas Stubbs. Hopefully many of you will remember that Alex Kentikalenis is a member of this collective, and don't know if he's zoomed in today, but is part of the group here. And just they make the case that public expenditure projections reveal that by 2023, 83 out of 189 countries in the world will face contractions in government spending compared to their 2010 average, exposing at least 2.3 billion people to austerity, socioeconomic consequences of budget cuts. Many of these contracting countries, or most, will be middle income. Low income countries are expected to stagnate. And the IMF is essentially, their analysis shows that the IMF is returning to extensive austerity measures, even though they're claiming that they've moved away from those. But things are actually quite grim going forward. So I am proud to say that the American Public Health Association adopted a statement last year that I and a group of folks here at the University of Washington, plus Alex Kentikalenis, drafted it's a 15-page statement, a lot of citations calling for international debt relief, really with a focus on canceling debt. The American Public Health Association, which is the biggest public health group in the United States, actually endorsed this, and it is now an official statement of the APHA. It asked to cancel debt among the countries in greatest debt distress, mobilize additional grant and financing resources, things like what they call the special drawing rights from the IMF, enhance debt restructuring, reject imposition of austerity programs, of substantially increased public spending. If you have any interest in reading the whole statement, this is the link here below online at the APHA site. To our shock and horror, the IMF did not cancel debt and did not reverse its austerity in response to the APHA resolution. But we're glad that it's out there. And very importantly, we wanted to highlight that there's a lot of discussion about canceling debt, but if that is not coupled with a rejection of austerity, then we're sort of missing the point. That many of the debt restructuring programs that are out there, including the Common Framework, come along with lots of conditionalities, as I'm sure you're aware of, to reduce spending, social spending. Now, importantly, there are different kinds of debt. So really quickly, there are loans from multilateral lending agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, but also regional development banks. There are bilateral loans, government to government, global North countries, global South countries. China is now emerging as a major creditor for the global South. But I want to focus just quickly on private commercial creditors. So private debt has become the new big challenge out there. The private banks and other private financial institutions, I'll talk a bit about those going forward. Private credits from manufacturers, exporters, etc. Private debt is now becoming the biggest chunk of international debt across the board. It is still a smaller percentage in low-income countries, but it's the largest chunk of debt for middle-income countries. And it is a real challenge and a real problem. This just shows the growth of private debt in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically from 2010 to 2021. It has nearly tripled in many countries. To this effect, there is a very interesting political process underway in the United States. In New York State is where New York City resides, and in New York City is where Wall Street is located. And about 56% of all the international debt to the global South actually runs through firms located in Wall Street in New York City. And in principle, they come under the legal authority of New York State. And so some clever debt justice folks have helped introduce a bill called the New York State Taxpayer and International Debt Crises Protection Act that would require private creditors with debt contracts in New York City to participate in debt relief at the same level as governments and other public creditors. And what's been happening is these private creditors will not join the debt restructuring that's being done by the G20 and the IMF. Now, I just want to be really clear, those debt restructuring processes are deeply problematic. They are insufficient, but they are better than what's happening in private credit. The private creditors, we often call them vulture funds, buy up bonds at cheap prices, and then they sue Global South countries to get their money back, and they won't participate in debt restructuring. So it is very, very onerous. It is a very wicked dimension to the debt crisis, which has only gotten worse and worse in recent years. So the idea of this bill would be to say there's going to be some legal constraints on what Wall Street firms can do and how they can manage their debt, and would force them to be part of debt restructuring. So that bill is now underway. It's going to become under discussion in March of this year. And the American Public Health Association is working with the New York State Public Health Association to do a lobbying campaign with the New York State legislators to try to get this bill passed. So we're collaborating by helping them produce campaign materials. We're lobbying with New York State representatives, actually going to their offices and meeting with them, and writing op-eds for media outlets, among other things, and basically trying to be the public health voice, saying what debt is doing to the Global South, creating conditions of austerity, making it impossible to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, universal health coverage, and making it impossible for Global South countries to invest in climate change kinds of policies. So that's the kind of work that we're focusing on here. We certainly have no illusions that this is going to transform the global debt crisis, but hopefully, if this law is passed, there's a similar kind of law that was passed in the UK in 2010, and 90% of all the private credit to the Global South runs through London and New York. Sort of replicating, of course, the imperialist and neo-colonial relationships between the Global North and Global South. But getting legal restrictions passed in both London and New York will potentially go a long way in reining in just a bit the actors here. So as has been mentioned, there is going to be opposition to our efforts at social justice, and there is a major lobbying effort now by Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, the New York Bankers Association against this legislation. It's quite a fight now. There's a group called the Partnership for New York City that is led by BlackRock Investment, one of the very biggest private equity firms in the world, Citibank, Morgan Stanley, a lot of the usual suspects, the big financial firms based in Wall Street that are pulling out the big guns to fight back against this legislation. And one reason is because
you're coming to the end of your time. You have about a minute left.
Great, perfect. And so that is the global struggle going on here. And as public health folks, we are directly engaged in this and trying to move the needle a bit. So I can talk further about this in the Q&A period. I just want to draw attention to Alex's new book that you may not have seen, but I want to give a little book plug. It's a terrific book. It's called 1,000 Cuts: Social Protection in the Age of Austerity, and it addresses exactly the debt crisis, austerity, and what it's doing to health systems around the Global South. So a wonderful piece of work from one of our own collective members here. I would also just say that we had a panel discussion that also included Jomo Kwame Sundaram and Alex at the APHA meetings back in 2021 about the debt crisis. That got lots of attention here in the U.S. And so the collective has been very active. So just wonderful to be here and to kind of let you know that the collective networking has led us to doing a lot of this work. Obrigado in Portuguese. These are the maternal child health nurses in the primary healthcare system in Mozambique that need all the help that we can muster to get resources to them to do their amazing work. Few resources here and links. I can make this available to folks if they're interested as we go forward. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I must say, I just wanted to add, I can't resist adding here that this debt crisis that James talked about is really terrible, because why do you think that there is a debt crisis? Why do you think that low and middle income countries are paying more and more in debt service? It's because the interest rates went up. International interest rates went up. And why did international interest rates go up? It's because the US Fed and other rich country governments raised interest rates. And why did they do that? To serve the needs of their own economies, to respond to domestic pressure. So, although that can also be argued as not the right right response, but in any case, the point is that the debt problem of low and middle income countries is not the making of their own neglect or negligence or profligacy or any of those things, right? So anyway, just had to get that off my chest. One of the things that makes me really angry. So now we have 45 minutes, a good 45 minutes for discussion. So now we're open to comments and questions on any of the three presentations. Do we have any? No? Okay. So we'll collect a few questions. The first is from Desmond.
Thank you very much. Yes, great. Three very good talks. I wanted to make a comment to James and then to Ted. James, I mean, your example about this New York Taxpayer Act is a brilliant example, because this morning we're talking, as of course we often do, about yes, okay, but what can we do, right? And how specific, it's not much use having general recommendations, and how specific can we be? And to me, this is a perfect example of a very specific and practical recommendation. Now, a proposal, and in order to make it, you need a detailed knowledge, not just of the problem, but of the realities of legislation in New York and all this stuff. Now, it may not be successful, but even if it's not, the very acts, the very process will have an important political effect. So I think it's great in itself, and as I say, as an example of the sort of thing when people say, well, what can you actually do? I would like, I say, yes, well, there are things like this, right? And what we need is more things like this, but they require special knowledge and people to follow through. And then to Ted, I agree very much with your argument about the injustices and the gloomy future, but I have a worry about this concept of a tipping point. I can see as an analytical concept, I see its validity in natural science, and indeed climate change, they may well be right, although they're having trouble identifying precisely where and what the tipping point is going to be. But I'm more unsure about it in the social sciences. Many years ago, I used to work on urban planning in what were then called developing countries. So we're going 50 years back. And the idea was, well, cities are getting too big. When they get to a 5 million, then it collapse. And then when they get to 10 million, they're going to collapse. And now, as we know, there's loads of cities well above. Now, they've got their huge problems, it's true. And a lot of people would say they're too big and so on. But the idea that there was a threshold turns out to be just empirically incorrect, right? And so I guess I've got two problems with the concept of the threshold. One is whether it's empirically valid in the social science with regard to social phenomena, but also perhaps the danger of the sort of crying wolf phenomenon. Say, well, using the threshold to urge people to act immediately. Yes, we need to act immediately, but somehow the idea of the threshold is just around the corner. I think can be problematic, and maybe to some extent in a way your final comment saying that we never know there's a threshold until in retrospect, to some extent, perhaps I would say supports my argument.
Yes, Kelly.
So I have thank you very much. Just 3 more really, really excellent presentations. It's my question actually trying to link all 3 of them, if I can. And Sakiko, you made a really good point about, the debt problem being perceived as somehow self-inflicted. That's really important, but it's a hard sell to the public, but an important one to make. But also the reduction or cancellation of debt, and particularly private debt, was a really important point, would impact what Ted described as those who have assets and those who do not. And it may impact the whole enterprise of capital accumulation. So I'm wondering how we separate that out, because you can have debt cancellation maybe to some extent, but unless it integrates with these other 2 talks, I'm not quite sure how we could achieve it to a degree that we need to. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, thank you for these 3 nice talks. I have a question on James's input. Maybe in addition to the G20 common framework, I find it's really interesting that there was basically just one successful case of Chad, and that was because of the rising oil prices. So all the other cases have not been solved successfully, which is, I think, really interesting to see. But that it's interesting that you also pointed out the very fragmented landscape of debt actors, with China as a big actor and the private companies, which makes it even harder to bring them all to the table and solve something. And that the presented case of legislation that you presented was really interesting, but I was wondering what your impression was on the IMF program strengthening health and social structures, at least in some parts, or maybe just dropping it as a name on their program. I think with Zambia, it's in the kind of contract they have that they want Zambia to strengthen the health and social structures, but I was wondering what your impression was on that. Thank you.
Okay, let's take these. Maybe we can first go to James.
Okay. Yeah, I've been furiously writing notes. Really, really wonderful questions. I really appreciated Desmond's reference to, that even if this is not successful, the process has a value. And that's kind of what we've been thinking, is just getting the discussion, getting people talking about this, and it's getting more and more attention in New York and New York City itself, because the Wall Street firms are really mobilizing it. So it's getting press attention now, and just drawing attention again to this global process, which is hard to get people to focus on in the global north, because they don't understand how devastating it is. I would just remind people, if you remember, a little over 20 years ago, we had the Jubilee movement at the turn of the century, which wasn't 100% successful, but it was somewhat successful. I remember participating in a street demonstration in Washington, D.C. with about 20,000, mostly young people, calling for the end of structural adjustment and the cancellation of debt. And I thought, wow, I thought I would never see street demonstrations around this. And there was, a little bit of success from that. There was a little bit of backing off by IMF and World Bank and as a result of that movement. And so I think, it's important to fight against the kind of fatalism when you're trying to struggle against such a global structure, and recognize that it matters to be getting the discussion going, thinking through how we can push back. And act in solidarity with our friends in the Global South who have been trying to speak out about this. So it's a difficult struggle. Don't know exactly the best way, but that's the spirit we're trying to bring to this. Sakiko brought up, I think, critical point is that it is often seen from the global north as the fault of corrupt, inefficient, incompetent governments in the global south. And to state perhaps the obvious, right, underpinning this is old global colonial racism, which says that African countries are too corrupt, they can't be trusted with the money. I've seen this over and over again in Mozambique. And that thinking is part of the system, right? That the debt is their fault, we have to bail them out, and what's wrong with these people? And we, as Sakiko pointed out, to really fight against this notion that these are self-inflicted, right? The international debt is a symptom of a global economic system of extraction and capital accumulation. And to draw attention to that and make it very clear that, not that, of course, money doesn't go sideways in local context, but that is not really the source of the debt crisis. And that is a point that has to consistently be emphasized. I mean, just real quickly, last question about specifically about the IMF and Zambia and the efforts to bail Zambia out of its very, very deep crisis that involves firms like BlackRock and others. That IMF does use this language. They've got savvier about saying, you know, they replace structural adjustment with the poverty reduction strategy papers. You may know this, right? And of course, what a euphemism, Orwellian euphemism that is, right? These are poverty creation mechanisms, but they call them poverty reduction mechanisms. And they will use that language, you know, strengthening the health sector and those kinds of things. And so my short answer to that is no, I don't think, I don't believe the IMF's language, and they are the, you know, the operational strong hand to enforce these kinds of austerity rules. And so we always have to keep them in our crosshairs of helping everybody understand. But they've gotten more clever at using that kind of language. And sometimes they will protect spending on health education while they're pushing austerity in other parts of the economy. And many writers now are pointing out that, well, you might be protecting some healthcare spending, but at the same time, you're destroying people's livelihoods and lives in other sectors of the economy through austerity programs. So how important it is to fight against austerity across the board, not just in health and education. So that's an interesting game that's being played now in sort of the discourse on this. I'll stop there.
What about the question that Kelly asked about debt cancellation as a problematic threat to the capitalist economic system, and what it would do?
Yeah, sorry, that very important question. Well, there's lots of, speaking of discourse, lots of discussion around what it would do. What we know is that if we cancel debt, especially in the most low-income countries, those with the worst debt distress, most economists would say that this is not going to be existential threat to the global system at all. It cut into some bottom lines and some profit margins. But debt cancellation, you know, many of these debts have already been repaid many times over with high interest rates, as Sakiko pointed out. They're making enormous amounts of money, the Wall Street firms that are engaged in this. And so canceling the debt is one of the demands of the debt justice movement generally. So very much a legitimate demand. And many economists would say canceling the debt will allow countries to invest in their social sector and actually help economies grow. You know, austerity, as we saw in Greece, austerity, you know, is devastating to economic growth in the long run. So I'll stop there.
I think just if I may add, I think that there are two problems. Well, first of all, that for the debtor country, debt cancellation has terrible consequences for their ability to borrow money in the future from financial markets. And that's why most countries do not want to cancel debt, because then, I mean, low-income countries have tremendous difficulty getting, you know, finance to invest in infrastructure or whatever, or long-term investment of that kind. And you can go to capital markets, but they pay much higher interest rates than higher income countries. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, poor households paying more in interest rate. So, but the second problem of this whole thing is that the debt workout mechanisms internationally are totally inadequate, insufficient. So, I mean, you know, historically, societies have worked out a way for people who are indebted not to be sent to debtor's prison, because that doesn't help anybody. But the same kind of system at the national level doesn't, you know, has been kind of gingerly put together, but it's very inadequate. And that's why the low and middle income countries have accumulated debt. This is odious debt. It's accumulated and it just never gets cleared out. And that's the real problem, so that whenever there is a crisis like the pandemic that puts a lot of pressure on your public finances, just think about the trillions of dollars that were just printed by high-income countries, by the US and so forth, to give, you know, stimulus packages and to give, like, income support to households during the pandemic. I mean, they really did print lots of money. But in the low and middle income countries, they couldn't afford to do that. And what they did, you know, put a lot of pressure on their economies and their public finances. And so that's why you had that pressure. But at the same time, when they started recovering 2021, 22, you were then hit by the increase in food prices and fuel prices because of Ukraine war, something else that is not of their making, if you know what I mean. So, and then on top of that, there was in 2022 the increase in interest rate payments to service the debt, and so this, so there is this pressure on countries to service and repay debt, and but the mechanisms that are in place, you know, just are not adequate. So that's, I think, the solution, the policy demand actually is for a more robust international debt workout mechanism, and that's on the agenda of all of these meetings, you know, financing for development and so forth. So now let's move to Ted. Can you answer the question by Desmond about tipping point?
I can try. Excuse me. Well, first of all, the fact that a concept can be misapplied, as the threshold concept was in the case of city size, or predictions can fail, doesn't mean that the concept lacks value. I mean, if misapplication were to rule out the use of a concept, there would be no social science. In the case of social systems, I would argue that tipping points operate largely by way of creating new and more powerful path dependencies, or else by changing institutions in a way that functions like a trapdoor. And our Canadian Constitution Act of 1982, which is in effect unamendable, is an example of that latter category. As for tipping points being identifiable only in retrospect, I mean, I don't see how that in any way makes the concept less useful. It means that it's more useful in historical analysis than on the kind of predictive limb that I was venturing out on.
Okay. Any other questions from the room? I have one here from an online participant, Else Torres. Hello, Else. How do you get governments on board to stop considering GDP growth as a primary success objective of their leadership? post-growth is primarily discussed in academic and civil society circles, not governments. And I would add also my own question to your paper. I mean, it's a beautiful analysis. But then when you say, how do you start making change? Surely the answer is political rather than anything else. It's not an intellectual process. So what kind of politics do you imagine? You know, what will trigger the incentives to get the right kind of politics? Because, and what do you think about Ted's prognosis that sort of says, well, you get to a point where inequality will be so bad that there will be no movement against, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think this is something that we need to discuss.
There have been environmental economists who have argued that how to get governments on board, maybe not knowing how to do that, but what governments have to do. And one of them is to set hard consumption targets. So kind of like how much one needs, how much we can consume. So kind of putting restrictions on, you know, like rating how many airline trips a person could make in a given year on a quota system. What size of cars? I mean, you could do all kinds of luxury taxes that could start to sort of dissuade the excess consumption of the 1%. So there are some models that could be used, some ideas that could be generated around that. But fundamentally, I think that where it links up with Ted's rather dystopian kind of concerns about the immediate future or tipping points or the longue durée, is that I think we're going to reach a point where the sheer absence of resources needed to sustain life. I mean, a lot of population groups in the global south are already experiencing that in terms of famine, poverty, immiseration, et cetera, That's creeping closer and closer into the capitalist core. Yes. We're going to reach these crisis points where we don't have enough resources for everyone to lead. That lovely phrase that Remco came up with, or that he cited about the imperial lifestyle. At that moment, I tend to think that the best thing that governments can do right now is support all the little kind of exercises, the little experiments that are happening at local levels in terms of alternative political economies, different kinds of sharing economies, different kind of cooperative economies, different kind of agriculture kind of systems that are being developed more on the margins of the core centers of capitalism, and might you might find them in some of the regions in the global south, especially around Latin America and the movements around ecology, for example. But I actually believe we are going to be facing some social collapse because we don't have the resources and the resource distributions that are going to allow this kind of accumulation to go on forever. I would love to see us putting all kinds of taxation on advertising. I mean, people consume not because they're born to consume, they're made into consumers. I grew up in the 50s. In the 1950s, what we felt was a really happy, healthy, fully satisfied life in terms of consumption was a fraction of what is being driven now for the idea of some kind of a normal life in terms of consumption. That was created. So we need to uncreate it.
Remco.
Well, I find it interesting also to look from a more historical, social perspective to what growth is and what it represents and why we. So there has been talks about fetishism as well. This consumption and production Fordism, they call it, in relation to the imperial mode of living. That's the bourgeois class who maintains a kind of hegemonic presence, and that they are represented in politics and through political constituency. That the feeding of this this politics and that it's not only about the GDP growth or the economics per se, it's the idea about what a good life is. I would argue that capitalism and the way how it appropriates, extracts, violates the periphery also violates the global core of the of how we live here in the global north. There is the notion we're getting this the burnout society as we are, mental illness problems as such, because we are so anxious in having our social status being related to how we consume and how we produce. So everything that we do, including debt cancellation and social protection and moving towards well-being economies, the degrowth or post-growth economists would say, it's also because we have a very flawed idea about what the good life is and what well-being should look like. And this is where politics misses a chance, because they're populist, they're reactive, because we want to maintain our consumptive levels. And then they would say directly, oh, but if you don't, if we take other considerations as economic growth, then we go into a recession and there will be unemployment, and it's that cart is always being pulled. So to provide for an alternative, that's where the challenge is. And I do, that's where there is a kind of a movement of movements of alternatives, of bottom-up approaches to show that there is, that does exist. This is where the sweet spot is. I do agree, though, that the argument and how it's put forward is very much I don't think that degrowth or post-growth is the universal solution that is needed. It's a very specific global north approach of linking with those southern initiatives that do exist. And maybe one thing still to say about, and this is about the limits to growth and implosion, the ecological economists would argue it's about absolute versus the what is it? The more how you call it? It's absolute versus proportional decoupling. They would argue that you cannot proportional decouple energy. You can proportional decouple energy use from production and growth, but if we would go into using massive renewable energy, etc., we would still require a lot of energetic extraction for new materials, etc. And so it's like if we really want to go to net zero and stay within those planetary boundaries, they would argue if we still focus on growth, it's like having to go down an escalator that is still going up. The most simple thing we can do is to stop doing harm, to stop pursuing some policies. Fossil fuel extraction is one of them, but the production, a lot of nonsense goods that we use is another one. They always use SUVs, for example, private jets. We can start regulating those things. We can start regulating the commercial terms of health that are harmful. So there are clear entry points.
Yeah, but then how do you get to those? I mean, how do you get these entry points to actually happen? I mean, this is the point about the need for you need a kind of politics that will make that actually a real movement, right? A real.
This is where narrative and stories come in. So what is a good life, and what kind of worldview do we adhere to that? And I think this is where we have difficulties with here in the West, and where we can learn perhaps from others outside.
Okay. Well, anyway, I think we can move on to a couple of other questions that we have from the online audience. We have a question from Christophe de Costa regarding well-being economies. Some countries made some progress for a while, but suffered a backlash afterwards. Is that because of their internal contradictions, perhaps partly due to global market constraints, or is it because it does not appeal to the masses or voters? I'm asking the question because I saw a picture of the latest, biggest cruise boat ever. Maybe it would be nice if Christoph would say something about what he means by the countries that made progress. Which is he referring to? And there's a second question, which is a follow-up from Else. Ron correctly pointed out that some of the progressive, transformative language in the WHO Economics Council report was not substantiated by concrete and realistic political action recommendations. There also lacks an analysis of the political power barriers that would need to be overcome. Do you have any actionable suggestions? So,
overcome the
the
barriers.
two of you, yes.
Well, this morning I put on the table for the time the next going forward with the idea of the political determinants of health is the importance of identifying exactly who those actors are and beginning to identify what the specific strategies are for reaching or regulating those actors. We have a very kind of an almost naive belief in the ability to just say, if we can just put in a regulation, things will get better. And I think we need to work in improving our regulations, much like, James, what you're doing with around the debt cancellation kind of initiative. But the interest and powerful interest individuals and groups that are in the way of the kind of transformations that the post-growth economists are talking about that we have to have if we're going to actually survive, is that they have a huge arsenal of lawyers, economists, legislators in their back pockets. The cliche I remember reading one time about when France was going to start to try to talk about putting in some kind of progressive tax reforms that included corporate tax measures. And the response on the part of the corporations was that, well, that's fine, they can try to do what they want. You know, like within half an hour or an hour, we'll be able to find all the loopholes in that legislation that allow us to be, you know, like avoid what the law was intending to sort of implement around tax progressivity. So I think that we need to be probably a little bit hard-headed about what regulations can do and how regulations can be enforced. And that where it touches on global governance is one of the great problems with global governance in a kind of intergovernmental, multi-stakeholder, or even multilateral context, is that very few of the decisions that are agreed upon across governments have any enforcement measures, actually any powerful enforcement measures. And it's not at all ironic that the only ones that do are the ones that are basically about protecting the capitalist economy. So maybe just to name it.
You have comments on this?
I think,
on these questions that we just had?
yeah, I think there was also another question that we can.
Well,
I will talk.
We'll do another round, so let's just.
Well, there was reference to the well-being. There's a well-being economic alliance, and they refer to 6 countries: Canada, Wales, Scotland, New Zealand, etc. They were doing well. Of course, they've moved forward through with their social policy, etc., social protection measures. That is possible, but it's not so much that they really reduced their material throughput, so to say. A lot of it was still appropriated through cheap labor via the importation from other goods outside. It was possible maybe during the pandemic time as well, because they had to be more self-reliant and autonomous. But I don't, if you look on the longer term, on the longue durée, as Ted was mentioning, I don't think that it really constitutes a real shift from an equity perspective. And so we have to be very careful to look at those specific countries as examples for other countries to be used. I have another point, but that might come a bit later still.
Well, we don't have very much more time. I think we have time for just one more round. So we have Desmond and we have Armina. Yes. So why don't we go to you first? Yeah?
Hi. I think this goes to the point Ron was making about the degrowth, or, you know, how do we define well-being? But then also, I think, conversely, isn't it also a little late? I mean, for example, in a rural household in India, for a family, the well-being standard is, when I am able to afford a car. So it's not possible to just change that you really don't need a car now, because so that well-being standard is that, when you are, is when you can afford a car, you can afford a house, and yeah, you can go to a city, you can have a house, live in the city. So those are what aspirations you grew up with, which is and which of course has a certain discourse which has followed that aspiration. But then you suddenly, just because, of course the West now realizes that, that is not affordable, it's very difficult to change that child's aspirational status, that you don't need to aspire for that. So that also. And also I think when you say the well-being standard was 6 countries, but then also then there is, for example, Bhutan, which has a very different language of well-being and a very different index to measure what does it mean to be happy and well. So where well-being is part of the constitutional language and where capabilities of what a person can do is also part of the language in the constitution in health. Yeah, so yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I suffer from a number of ambivalences, and one of them is about well-being. Because I obviously agree entirely that well-being is a much more important thing than GDP per capita. But well, in fact, Sakiko did an interesting work on the SDG debates about poverty and inequality, where she demonstrated, and correct me if I'm wrong, that initially the debates were about inequality, and then they were, to some extent, depoliticized by replacing inequality by leaving no one behind. Yeah. Now, who can object to saying leave no one behind? But in practice, it turned out to be rather important. And similarly, my worry is that well-being can be politically less effective. There's I forget his name, maybe Julian Legrand. Anyway, I tend to quote him. He said, the best way to redistribute income is to redistribute income, right? And there's a danger, perhaps, that talking about well-being may be taking some of the political bite out of what is a very important discussion.
Yes. Okay, we have a final question from the online audience, and I think that's it. No, nobody else? Okay, this is a final question from Kirsten. Pension funds have become quite active in trying to make shifts in sectors they invest in. Is this a positive shift? Today I read in a Norwegian newspaper that the head of Norway's largest pension fund will sue the Silicon Valley Bank for distorting the market. So, I'm not quite sure who that is to, maybe to James? Anyway, okay, so who wants to go first? And after you answer these questions, I'll give you another round of 1-minute final comments. So
I let Ron maybe say something about the well-being economy?
Okay,
Frank?
Around the well-being thing, I'm ambivalent about it as well. And when I first sort of came across it and sort of read, I was sort of saying, oh, kind of like this is like quality of life redux. We've been here many times before. We've tried this with social indicators. We've tried this with other kind of measures. The GDP's been trashed for 40 years in terms of that kind of critique. So what's new about it? And there's probably not a whole lot that's new about it, except that a lot of the, at least the direction of some of the policy statements, some of the kind of policy goals and initiatives in things like the Earth for All, to some extent also the WHO Council, at least are pointing in a direction that would start to reframe how we think about what the nature of the economy is. Post-growth, degrowth, those are not exactly popular global terms. And I think I'm listening here now in terms of like in India and perception of what constitutes well-being. Oh, being well. Well, we have a consumption model, a consumerist model, where we've been in fact inculcated, almost like entranced, for the interests of others, not necessarily for our own interests, that this is what compromises or comprises well-being. But I think if you ask most people, what it is to be well. They're going to talk about things like the quality of their relationships, the ability to sort of have a certain amount of security or stability, to be able to eat well, to be able to walk safely out around in their neighborhood, to be able to look after their children in some way. Those sorts of things, which are really about the quality of social relationships. So I think if we're going to talk about well-being, we need to talk about what it is, like tap into what people's understanding is of importance in their own life experiences, not about the material kind of, because that's mostly about social class, social status, etc. That's what that measure of well-being about. Just like GDP, it's a flawed concept of well-being. But more precisely, I share the concern that you raised, Desmond, about I'm very worried that well-being will become just another kind of health washing, well-being washing, blue rinsing, some other kind of love. Nice little way. I mean, Canada, okay, we're one of the so-called well-being countries that have bought in on this. What did Canada do? It basically sort of came up with, changed some of the indicators in Stats Canada surveys to add a few more things about well-being. And it has a well-being, but really largely unimplemented little tick box for budget, kind of a budget analysis of how this is, going to improve well-being. But the group that I'm involved with in Canada, Canadian Centres for Policy Alternative, and on the alternative federal budgets, this process that they go by, they looked at the last set of federal budgets since Canada became a well-being country and sort of said, it doesn't seem to have affected any of the decisions that they're making across any of the different departments. So you've got this window dressing effect, and I'm very concerned about that. I still like the concept. I find the concept an easier concept to try to sell if you begin to explain it, a bit easier than something like post-growth or degrowth. But I'm very concerned about how it's eminently co-optable.
Maybe I can add to that, because in a sense it's about historical justice, historical and future intergenerational justice. It's very legitimate to have some claim in an Indian rural area that people have access to mobility, a car, and decent housing. But to be able to do that and to have the carbon space and also the economic growth still necessary for domestic economic activities, there needs to be a relative economic decline, or at least a decline in consumption production of goods here. And that's very difficult. So because the per capita, both financial resource use and also real energy use or carbon emissions, they are still on the rise in the OECD countries, and that needs to reduce as well. So it's this double goal, and this is very very difficult. And this is also how it's often portrayed as well, is population growth, and in India and in the rising African cities, people should live within their means, etc. So it can become very populist use, and we need to be very careful that it's not an eco-authoritarian approach that will be a kind of a new form of neo-colonialism. Yeah. There's one thing that I still wanted to say, and that is, and we did not touch about it, is the role of healthcare as part of economic growth, and this is something I think as a collective we could explore. A lot of growth in healthcare is actually of relative low value, and that there might also be limits to healthcare expenditure as well, for the benefit of much more public health or health promotion expenditure. But that requires a different discussion, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I mean, I think on the well-being thing, there are different ways of defining well-being, and international human rights standards. Civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights are internationally debated and agreed standards. I mean, it's not, a lot of people talk about well-being, but they just kind of made it up out of nowhere individually. Martha Nussbaum says they're the 10 central capabilities, and that's what's valuable. But, I mean, whatever you think about international human rights standards, they actually have been debated for a very long time, and then examined, and then not just debated among like 10 people in a room or people who think they're very intelligent, but sort of like globally in a kind of an accountable, legitimate process of international negotiations. So I still think that the economic and social cultural rights particularly have a lot to do with the well-being notion. Anyway, so I'm going to give everybody 1 minute each, because we have 5 minutes left to say their final words. Let's start with James.
All right, thank you, everybody. 1 minute. Really quickly, Sakiko, I just want to point out that there are a number of health economists that would say that debt cancellation does not endanger a country's ability to access more credit. And it's often used as an argument to not cancel debt, but in many cases, that's more debt would be, more credit would actually be forthcoming. Secondly, around well-being, just to kind of make an obvious point, but in many places, especially in areas of Africa where I've worked, Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique, well-being, there's basically the well-being is, can I afford a meal, right? Not a car. And so well-being is defined by the right to survive, right? The right to get vaccination, the right to have antiretroviral therapy and treatment, which is threatened by the debt crisis and austerity. So I think in many low-income countries, well-being has a very, very low threshold that I think we need to be aware of. Just meeting the basics, the notion of the right to survive, I think, is very important, and that's what's at stake in the debt crisis. Finally, none of us have talked about the emergent right-wing populism, ethno-nationalism, and fascism sweeping much of the world. I'm in a country facing a very, very frightening election year period, and the politics are extremely scrambled. And how we do our work within this very, very quickly changing and frightening political landscape is something to consider. I have no idea what the answers are, but I would say, I know you're hearing lots of scary news from the United States. I just want to also point out that we have a resurgent labor movement, and there's actually some things happening across the country that suggest the need for us to make coalitions as public health people, as health activists, with the labor movement, with other resurgent movements on the left, because we're heading into a very, obviously extremely turbulent period. And so all these questions we're talking about are going to be intersecting with that level of politics. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there, and I just really, really enjoyed this discussion.
Ed, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, the concept of degrowth or post-growth seems to be especially popular among university faculty. Yet, when I was working in the UK during the last few years, there were lengthy and only partially successful industrial actions on the part of lecturers in many universities. And I cannot recall a single demand for going back to the 1950s, as Ron suggested, in terms of consumption patterns. When I see lecturers on the picket line with signs saying things like "back to the 50s," I will start taking the concept seriously. Not until then.
Right. Ron.
I'll have to send you a copy of my placard, then, the one that I use on the picket lines. Let's say, for one point that I would make is that first of all, in April, we're going to be having another People's Health Assembly. James, you probably know about it. That'll take place. The good news is it's going to be on a theme, in part, of buen vivir, kind of the Latin American concept of living well. But it's also going to be very critical in terms of how we approach living well. But still, it's good. That's part of the good news. The less good news is that it's going to be in Argentina. And we know what just happened there with the election of a certain kind of president. So we're not quite sure exactly how well we're going to be able to live while we're at the People's Health Assembly in Argentina. One final point I would make is that as we try to look at coping with what are going to be environmental limits, that we already have environmental and consumption limits. So whether we go back to the 50s or not, Ted, at some point we're not going to have a choice because we're not going to have the stuff anymore. And that is that it's going to affect a lot of us much more so than we actually sort of think. And I think it's going to affect a lot of us who are older. because in some respects, we've had the best run of it. And now, in many ways, our future retirement actually is still very much dependent upon the kind of asset classes that rely upon the huge exploitation of most of the rest of humanity. So we have to kind of grapple with our own entanglement with this particular economic form of toxic economic model.
Okay, I think there is a lot of to be won by working with or looking at the political ecology and decoloniality scholars and what kind of approaches they use. There is it's very useful for us from the health field because it's their concept of what health and the good life is might be quite different, and I think we can find each other there. So there is a lot of space, more conceptually, etc. But we need to look at it very in an empirical way. We need to see what matters and not for people, because I do agree. Also, from a policy perspective, we need to link with those that try to find alternatives and those in communities that try to work with the commons, etc., or whether it's buen vivir, and that is something we can certainly do. I would like to mention as well is that what we've presented here, it's available. We can send it as a working paper for those that are interested. What Ron and me have written about post-growth and why it's relevant for health, we can also share that. And once again, we need to be clear. This is a kind of a Western understanding of what is needed to address the real physical limits to growth. There are really be material limits to growth, but it should not be an imposition of Western values on the rest of the world. It's a complementary rather than the next new thing.
Well, thank you very much. I think this was a fascinating session, and thanks to each of the speakers for really being a very disciplined and organized speaker, and very inspiring, and although somewhat depressing. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to everyone who's contributed today and to this last panel, and especially to Ted for making us laugh a bit at the end of what was a somewhat dystopic set of analyses. I also want to really thank the people who've made it possible for us to run today, especially Emma, and also Christopher and Paul and Doug, who braved the snowstorm yesterday to set up this hybrid solution. Otherwise, nobody would be able to follow this. So thank you very much. I hope people will come back tomorrow. We have 3 sessions tomorrow. First on innovation, medical products, and equity. Then on pandemic response at the public-private interface. And finally, a very exciting session on tech data and the political determinants of health, with no less than 5 presentations coming at us from all over the world. So I hope you've enjoyed today and hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.